It was supposed to be a joyful night. The kind of night you plan months in advance, the kind where everyone dresses a little nicer and pretends life is exactly how it should be. My daughter Natalie's 10th wedding anniversary was being celebrated in a private event hall in Naperville, one of those polished suburban venues with cream-colored walls, soft lighting, and framed photos of past weddings lining the hallway. The room smelled like garlic bread and roasted chicken from a well-known Italian restaurant downtown. Servers moved smoothly between tables, refilling wine glasses and laughing quietly with guests they recognized. A slideshow played on a large screen near the stage. Photos from Natalie and Chris's wedding 10 years ago faded in and out, her veil blowing in the wind, their awkward first dance, my husband Evan wiping tears from his eyes back then, telling everyone how proud he was of his little girl. Our grandkids were everywhere. One chased another between the tables. Someone's toddler clutched a breadstick like it was treasure. Laughter filled the room. Life felt full. Then my husband stood up. At first, no one thought anything of it. Evan Caldwell always liked speeches. He tapped his fork against his wine glass, smiling the way he always did when he wanted attention. "Tonight feels like the right time to be honest," he said. A few people chuckled, expecting a sentimental toast. "I'm starting a new life," he continued, pausing just long enough to make everyone lean in. "Without my wife." The words hit the room like a dropped plate. Conversation died instantly. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Someone near the back let out a quiet gasp. Even the children seemed to sense something was wrong and went silent. I felt every eye turned toward me. Across the table, the woman sitting beside Evan, his so-called business consultant, didn't react at all. No shock. No confusion. She just adjusted her napkin and took a slow sip of her wine, like she already knew. I was 57 years old. Married to Evan for over 3 decades. And in that moment, in front of our children, our grandchildren, our friends, our community, my husband had decided this was how our marriage would end. People were waiting for me to cry, to yell, to cause a scene. Instead, I smiled. A small, polite smile. The kind you give when you've already processed the truth long before anyone else in the room. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, as everyone waited for my breakdown. It never came. Before I tell you what I did next, if you've ever watched someone disrespect a woman who gave everything to her family and thought, someone should have warned her, then don't scroll past. Subscribe now. And comment where you're watching from, because stories like this only get told when people choose to listen. The room stayed frozen. No music. No clinking glasses. No polite laughter to smooth things over. Just the low hum of the projector fan and the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. Evan was still standing, his wine glass hovering midair, his smile beginning to stiffen as the seconds stretched on longer than he expected. This was the part where I was supposed to react. Cry. Shout. Ask him, how could you do this to me? Instead, I reached into my purse. Not in a dramatic way, no shaking hands, no sharp movements. Just calm. The kind of calm that makes people uneasy because they can't predict what comes next. My fingers closed around a cream-colored envelope, thick, neatly sealed, my name written nowhere on the outside. I stood, walked the few steps toward Evan, and gently placed it beside his dessert plate, right next to the untouched slice of tiramisu he'd ordered earlier. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Something sweet, sitting beside something that would leave a bitter taste for the rest of his life. Evan frowned, glancing down at it, then back up at me. "What's that?" he asked quietly, his voice no longer confident, just curious, edged with concern. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned away from him and looked at my daughter. Natalie was pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes glassy as she tried to hold herself together. 10 years of marriage being celebrated, and her father had turned it into a spectacle. I leaned down, kissed her cheek gently, and whispered so only she could hear me, "This is still your night. Don't let anyone steal it." Her lips trembled. She nodded, barely holding back tears. I straightened up and looked around the room, at the friends who had known us for decades, the relatives who had eaten at our table on holidays, the neighbors who had waved at us from driveways for years. Some looked shocked. Some looked embarrassed. A few looked angry on my behalf. "Please," I said calmly, my voice steady, "enjoy the rest of the evening." And with that, I picked up my purse and walked toward the exit. The whispers started immediately. Low at first, then louder. People leaned toward each other. Chairs scraped against the floor. I didn't look back. The heavy doors of the event hall closed behind me with a soft but final thud, muffling the noise inside. For the first time since Evan had spoken, I took a deep breath. The hallway outside was quiet, carpeted, softly lit. A framed photo of another smiling couple hung crooked on the wall. I took a few steps toward the elevators, my heels echoing faintly. Then I heard hurried footsteps. "Lorraine." Evan's voice cracked through the silence, sharp and panicked now. The confident man who had just announced the end of our marriage in front of everyone was gone. He caught up to me, grabbing my arm lightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to stop me. "What did you give me?" he demanded, eyes darting nervously back toward the ballroom doors. "What's in that envelope?" "Something for you to read later," I said simply. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime. Evan's face tightened. "Lorraine, you're not taking this seriously." I stepped inside the elevator and turned back toward him one last time. "Oh," I said calmly, "I am." The doors closed between us. As the elevator descended, I watched his reflection disappear in the mirrored panels, his mouth still moving, still asking questions he wasn't ready to hear the answers to. As the elevator descended, I didn't cry. I stood there quietly, purse over my shoulder, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. And in that silence, I thought about how I got here, not just to that hotel, but to that moment. My name is Lorraine Caldwell. I had been married to Evan for 31 years. 31 years of shared routines. Shared holidays. Shared bank accounts. Shared plans that always seemed to bend in his direction. Before anyone ever called me just a wife, I had a career. I worked as an accounts manager at a regional credit union just outside Chicago, the kind of place where people came not only for loans, but for advice. I balanced books, caught inconsistencies, flagged suspicious transfers. I understood how money moved, how it disappeared, and how it could be quietly redirected if no one was paying attention. At home, I managed everything. Every mortgage payment, every tuition bill, every car note, every emergency expense Evan swore we could figure out later. He liked to say finances stressed him out. So I carried that stress for both of us. When our children were young, I packed lunches in the morning and logged into our accounts at night, making sure the numbers still worked. When Evan's paychecks fluctuated, I adjusted. When something went wrong, I absorbed it quietly and kept going. I had dreams too, ones I learned to tuck away neatly. I loved cooking. Not just for family dinners, but for people. Events. Celebrations. I once dreamed of starting a small catering business, something local, something that felt like mine. But the timing was never right. After the kids are older, after Evan's job stabilizes, after this move, after the next opportunity. And there were always opportunities. Evan's opportunities. We moved twice for his career growth. Once to follow a startup role that dissolved within a year. Another time for a partnership that looked promising on paper but collapsed before the ink dried. Each move meant new schools for the kids, new routines, new sacrifices, and me rebuilding stability from scratch. Evan liked bold ideas. He liked risk, at least the kind he didn't have to personally clean up. There was the brewery idea in Wisconsin. He swore craft beer was the future, that he'd found the perfect location near a tourist route. I helped with the projections, pointed out the red flags. He ignored them. When it failed, I reworked our finances, quietly covered the losses, and made sure the kids never felt the impact. Then came the motorcycle phase. 52 years old. No warning. One afternoon he came home grinning like a teenager and announced he'd bought a bike. Said it made him feel alive again. Said he deserved it. I handled the insurance increase, the unexpected repairs, the payments he forgot to make. That was our pattern. Evan chased impulses, I handled consequences. I was the one who stayed up late recalculating budgets. The one who shifted money around so bills were paid on time. The one who reassured him everything was fine when it barely was. So standing alone in that elevator, after everything he had just done, I wasn't confused. I had spent decades being the quiet foundation beneath his chaos. And foundations don't crumble loudly, they crack silently, long before anyone notices. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, I knew something Evan didn't yet understand. That moment at the anniversary party didn't mark the end of my life. It marked the first time I stopped carrying his. By the time I stepped out into the cool night air, the image of that woman beside Evan was already replaying in my mind. Rhea Montrose. That was how Evan had introduced her nearly 2 years earlier, his branding consultant. Smart. Polished. Always dressed like she had just stepped out of a magazine, but careful never to look overdressed. She shook my hand firmly the first time we met, smiled wide, and said, "I've heard so much about you, Lorraine. Evan says you're the backbone of everything." At the time, I took it as a compliment. Rhea became a fixture in our lives so gradually that I didn't even notice when she stopped being a stranger and started being familiar. She helped plan Evan's milestone birthday dinner. She offered suggestions for Natalie's anniversary slideshow. She sat at our dining table, sipping iced tea, talking about market trends and personal branding while complimenting my cooking. She had opinions on everything, and delivered them like favors. She told me which caterer was overpriced, which florist in DuPage County was worth the money, which mutual funds were safe for women our age. She even sat beside me once, scrolling through investment charts on her tablet, explaining retirement strategies like she was doing me a kindness. "You've done such a good job keeping everything stable," she said warmly. "You deserve security." Looking back, I realize how carefully she chose her words. I didn't start suspecting an affair right away. That would have been too easy. Too obvious. Instead, I noticed something else first. The numbers. A reimbursement that didn't line up with an expense report. A transfer labeled consulting costs that seemed just a little too frequent. Small amounts at first, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I had spent my career paying attention. When I asked Evan about it, casually, the way you do when you don't want to sound accusatory, he waved it off. "Oh, Rhea fronted some costs. I reimbursed her. Business expense. I'll explain later. Things are tight right now, but it'll balance out." "They always balance out," he used to say. Except they weren't. I started quietly pulling statements, lining them up month by month. Not obsessively, methodically. I noticed how often Rhea's name appeared, sometimes directly, sometimes buried beneath vague descriptions. Then came the dinners. Late meetings that ran long. Weekend strategy sessions. Phone calls he took outside, pacing the driveway like a teenager hiding secrets. I never confronted him. Not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. I wanted to see how far he'd go when he thought no one was watching. I watched how Rhea positioned herself, never too close in public, always just professional enough. I watched how she looked at him when she thought no one noticed. I watched how confidently she spoke about our future, as if she already knew something I didn't. And slowly, painfully, the pattern became clear. This wasn't just a relationship. It was a plan. Evan wasn't reckless this time. He was careful, calculated. And Rhea wasn't just a bystander, she was helping him rehearse a life where I no longer existed. So I did what I'd always done best. I stayed quiet. And I started documenting everything. If you're watching this and thinking, she should have trusted her instincts sooner, pause. Subscribe right now, because silence is how people like Evan get away with this. And tell me in the comments, would you have waited or confronted? The elevator doors had closed, and the hallway had fallen quiet behind me, but my mind was racing faster than it had in decades. The calm exterior I wore at the anniversary party wasn't an act, it was strategy. Because I knew what I had to do next, and it started with understanding exactly what I was up against. Over the following weeks, I began to uncover the truth, layer by layer, like peeling an onion. It started with finances. Evan had always handled business expenses himself, with vague explanations and casual assurances. But as I dug deeper, a pattern became unmistakable. He had opened a separate business account, one that wasn't in my name and wasn't linked to any joint accounts we shared. At first, the amounts were small. A few $100s here, a few hundred there, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But over time, they became substantial. Transfers, deposits, reimbursements, all meticulously tracked, all hidden behind his casual reassurances that it was just for the business. And then, the messages. One morning, he left his phone on the kitchen counter. I glanced at it, and there it was. Text messages between him and Rhea Montrose, carefully planned, rehearsed, and timed. I'll tell her after the anniversary party. It'll be easier that way. Everything is set for the weekend. I just need the final numbers for the condo. We'll be free by Monday. She won't suspect a thing. I stared at the screen, stomach twisting. Every detail he had promised himself to Rhea was calculated to make me look weak, to steal control in a single moment. But there was something else, something I had remembered from years ago, tucked away in a dusty filing cabinet. The prenuptial agreement from 1992. Signed the week we married, back when we were young, naive, and full of dreams. I had reread it recently while going through old files. It had a clause that remained shockingly clear, even decades later. Fidelity clause: if either party engages in extramarital affairs, they forfeit claims to marital assets, joint property, and certain financial benefits. I realized that the same man who thought he could humiliate me at a public celebration had forgotten, or assumed I'd forgotten, the document that could protect everything I had worked for. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And I knew exactly how to pursue it. I contacted a family law attorney in DuPage County, someone highly recommended by a colleague at the credit union who had handled complex divorces with precision. Every conversation with her clarified the path I needed to take. I also hired a financial forensics specialist, someone who could trace Evan's hidden transfers and document every suspicious transaction. I wanted irrefutable evidence, every small amount that had disappeared, every cent diverted to accounts I had no access to, every pattern of dishonesty meticulously recorded. For 7 months, I prepared. Quietly. Methodically. No one outside of my closest circle knew the details. I continued my daily routines, helping Natalie with her kids, driving to local grocery stores in Naperville, chatting with friends at the farmer's market, pretending life was normal. But behind the scenes, I was building a case that even Evan couldn't ignore. Every spreadsheet I made, every attorney consultation, every recorded irregularity brought me closer to the day when the public announcement he had made with so much arrogance would backfire spectacularly. I learned patience. I learned observation. And I learned that the truth, when prepared for carefully, can strike harder than any sudden confrontation. That anniversary party had been his moment. But the moment I had been preparing for over 7 months would be mine. I drove home from Natalie's anniversary party in a quiet daze, my thoughts spinning faster than the streetlights reflecting off my windshield in Naperville's sleepy residential streets. The envelope I had left at the hall wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration. And now, the next act was about to unfold in the place I had always thought of as a sanctuary, our home. When I pulled into the driveway of our Maplewood Lane home, I noticed the lights on in the living room. That shouldn't have surprised me. Evan had always been the first to get home, but something in the stillness of the night felt different. The air carried tension, even through the closed front door. As I stepped inside, the familiar smell of our kitchen, baked bread and lingering coffee, felt almost ironic. Everything looked normal. Yet the house carried a weight, a sense of anticipation I couldn't ignore. Then I saw them. Suitcases. Neatly packed. Strategically tucked behind the winter coats in the master bedroom closet. He had planned this moment for months, just like he had the envelopes stunned at the party. Each bag represented a fantasy he had been building, a life with Rhea in a condo by Lake Michigan, overlooking the water he had boasted about during long weekend drives. And yet, despite the looming storm, I remained calm. I opened the envelope that had traveled from my purse to his dessert plate and back, mentally retracing the path of my careful strategy. It contained everything he needed to panic. Divorce filing, filed that morning with the DuPage County Court. Notice of account freeze, ensuring that every joint account he had used to funnel money to Rhea was now temporarily inaccessible. Evan's plan, which had seemed so neat and elegant at Natalie's anniversary, was already unraveling. And yet he didn't know it, not fully. When he came in, I could hear his shoes against the hardwood floors before he entered the living room. His usual calm, arrogant swagger was gone. Instead, he looked like a man realizing that the carefully constructed world he had been living in, one built on lies, distractions, and assumptions, was collapsing. Lorraine. His voice was sharp, edged with disbelief and fury. What is this? I didn't rise to the bait. I didn't yell. I didn't rush to explain. I simply poured myself a cup of tea from the counter and set it gently on the table. That envelope, I said, my tone light, almost conversational, contains a few things I thought you should see before you go chasing new adventures. He staggered back a step, crumpling the papers in his hand, realizing the magnitude of what he had just received. The divorce filing. The frozen accounts. Everything meticulously prepared to ensure that the consequences of his betrayal would be inescapable. You can't do this, he yelled, voice cracking. We've been married for 31 years. I looked at him with measured calm, the same calm I had carried at the anniversary party. 31 years, I said softly, and apparently, that's exactly how long it took for me to see the real you. Evan's eyes darted around the living room, landing on the packed suitcases. His fantasy condo near Lake Michigan, the weekend trips, the escape plan, it was all laid bare. And I could see the panic creeping in as he realized that even his plans for Rhea weren't untouchable. Lorraine, we can talk, he said, trying to regain composure. We don't have to, I didn't interrupt. I simply sipped my tea and nodded toward the hallway. The message was clear, the house, The life he had assumed was his to leave behind was no longer a safe place for his fantasies. For the first time in years, Evan was confronting the consequences of his own actions. And I was ready, calm and steady, to see them through. The living room was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes every second feel longer than it is. I had just poured another cup of tea, settling into the calm I had cultivated over months of preparation. The suitcases behind Evan's winter coats, the divorce papers in his hand, the frozen accounts, everything was in place. And then, there was a knock at the door. "Mom? It's us." Natalie, my daughter, and her husband Chris, stepped in, still in the elegant attire they had worn to the anniversary party. Natalie's eyes immediately scanned the room, noting the tension in the air, the evidence of chaos quietly waiting behind closed doors. "Mom, what's going on?" Chris asked gently, sensing the gravity in her voice. I smiled softly, trying to ease the sudden shock that would hit them harder once they saw their father. "Sit down," I said calmly, motioning toward the living room sofa. "I think it's time you both heard the full story." Moments later, my phone buzzed. It was Marcus, my son, calling from Denver. He had been traveling for work and hadn't been at the party. "Mom." "I heard what happened," he said, voice tight with confusion and disbelief. Is this true?" I nodded. "Yes. And it's been going on longer than you realize." Natalie's eyes widened, her hand gripping Chris's arm instinctively. "All this, and we didn't know? How could we not have seen this?" she whispered, a mix of shock and guilt. Chris put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Natalie, you didn't know." Marcus was quiet for a moment on the phone, then his tone hardened with frustration. "Dad, he actually announced he's starting a new life, without you, at my anniversary party? That's insane." Evan, sensing that the moment had slipped out of his control, tried to regain the narrative. "Natalie." "Marcus, listen. Lorraine, she's overreacting. I was planning to tell her privately. This is all a misunderstanding." I reached for my laptop, opened a folder I had prepared months ago, and selected the audio recordings. "These aren't misunderstandings," I said calmly. "These are your father's own words. Conversations from our home, our kitchen, even his car. Planning, scheming, taking money that wasn't his, plotting a life without me." I played the first recording. Evan's voice echoed through the room. "By the anniversary, she won't suspect a thing. Everything is set. The condo, the savings, it's all going according to plan." Natalie gasped. Chris tightened his grip on her hand. Marcus's face turned pale over the phone. I pressed play on the next one. "Rhea is handling the branding. I just need to make sure the finances are clear. Lorraine trusts me completely. That's her weakness." The room grew heavy with disbelief. My children's shock turned into anger, then to a quiet, simmering fury. You lied to all of us," Marcus said, his voice breaking with hurt and rage. "All these years, you've been pretending?" Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We should have seen this. We should have noticed." I reached for her hand. "It's not your fault. He was careful. He was secretive. And I needed to protect you both from knowing until the right time." Evan's face twisted with desperation. "Kids, you have to understand, I never meant for this to get out like this. Lorraine, she's making this worse." I shook my head, my voice steady but firm. "No, Evan. I'm showing them the truth. For once, you can't control the story. Marcus leaned against the doorway, fists clenched. I can't believe this. Dad, how could you? Natalie turned to her father, anger in her eyes. We trusted you. You embarrassed us. You lied about everything. And you thought we wouldn't notice? Chris spoke up, voice calm but unwavering. Evan, it's over. The truth is out. And your children are not going to ignore it. I let the recordings play, one after the other, documenting every lie, every plan, every betrayal. By the time the last one ended, Evan looked smaller, weaker, completely stripped of the confident facade he had carried for years. My children had chosen the truth. They had chosen me. And in that moment, the foundation of his carefully constructed fantasy life began to crumble, right there in the room he had assumed he still controlled. The betrayal was public. The reckoning was private. And my family, my real family, stood firmly by my side. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy, gray sky over Wheaton, mirroring the tension in my chest. I parked in front of the DuPage County Courthouse, its historic brick facade casting long shadows on the sidewalk. My hands were steady as I gathered my documents, financial statements, transaction records, text logs, the audio recordings of Evan's conversations, and the original prenuptial agreement. Every piece had been meticulously prepared over 7 months. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, the low murmur of people settling and creating a background hum. The judge, Judge Margaret Hensley, was known locally for her strict rulings and no-nonsense approach. Her reputation preceded her. She had handled high-profile cases with precision, never allowing theatrics to overshadow the facts. I felt a quiet confidence knowing the truth was on my side. Evan entered with Tommy Bryant, his newly hired, young attorney, who had little experience in family law. His suit was sharp, but his nervous energy betrayed him. Evan tried to maintain his usual air of superiority, but it faltered the moment he saw the files I had laid out. The hearing began. Judge Hensley scanned the prenuptial agreement first, her sharp eyes lingering on the fidelity clause. Section 12 states clearly that any infidelity impacts claims to marital assets, she said, her voice firm. Is there a dispute regarding its validity? Tommy stammered, flipping through the papers. Your Honor, well, technically, the agreement, it may be considered outdated. Judge Hensley's gaze cut him off. Outdated? Mr. Bryant, the agreement is a legal document. I see no expiration clause. Let us proceed with evidence. I presented the financial records, showing the systematic transfers Evan had made to Ria's accounts. The auditor's statements lined up with the timelines of his weekend trips, late-night calls, and suspicious purchases. Judge Hensley reviewed everything carefully, nodding as she absorbed the details. These transactions indicate deliberate attempts to divert funds from marital assets. Mr. Caldwell, how do you respond? Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His confident composure had evaporated, replaced by visible panic. Tommy fumbled with papers, whispering suggestions that were quickly shut down by the judge. Given the evidence presented, Judge Hensley continued, I am ordering the following immediately. All joint accounts remain frozen until further review. The marital home will remain in Mrs. Caldwell's possession during the proceedings. Mr. Caldwell retains access only to his personal account for essential expenses. Evan's face flushed crimson. His lips quivered as he muttered something about unfairness, but the judge didn't flinch. You may argue further in the full hearing next month, she added, but for now, Mrs. Caldwell's security and the integrity of the assets are protected. I exhaled quietly, keeping my composure. Around me, I could feel the weight of months of preparation culminating in this moment. Evan, once so certain of his plans and control, now sat frozen, the first cracks of his fantasy life showing for all to see. Even the small crowd of observers, neighbors, friends, and a few curious locals watched as the facade I had endured for years finally collapsed. The courtroom was no longer a place of intimidation for him. It was reality. If you're still watching, ask yourself why. Because you needed to see that accountability exists. So, don't leave without subscribing. And comment one word that describes Evan right now in the comments section. The courthouse hallway was quiet when I stepped out, the winter chill of Wheaton brushing against my face. I had expected some sense of relief, but what came next was something more subtle, an understanding that life was about to recalibrate. I had protected my family, secured my home, and preserved the truth, but the ripples of justice were only beginning to spread. Within days, the consequences hit Evan like a tidal wave. First, his reputation, carefully cultivated over decades in Naperville and the surrounding suburbs, crumbled. Friends who had once toasted his success and dedication now whispered about the financial mismanagement and betrayal. The local Rotary Club, where he had held leadership roles for years, removed him from all positions. Invitations to charity events and board meetings stopped coming entirely. Those connections he had relied on for validation were suddenly gone. Business partners began to dissolve relationships as well. The brewery in Wisconsin that had been a failed experiment years ago suddenly became a point of mockery among investors and colleagues. His startup consulting venture, which had seemed promising when combined with Ria's branding expertise, collapsed when she pulled out after discovering the truth about his financial instability. Speaking of Ria, she vanished as quickly as she had appeared. Once the money dried up and Evan could no longer support the lavish dinners, weekend trips, and expensive gifts, she quietly moved out of the condo near Lake Michigan and returned to her own life, leaving Evan to face the aftermath alone. I heard the news through whispers of mutual acquaintances and a few candid texts from friends who knew what had been happening behind closed doors. Then came the more personal rumors, the ones that confirmed the final reality. Evan was now renting a small basement apartment in Oakbrook Terrace, a modest space far removed from the comfortable home he had shared with me for over 3 decades. It was a humbling, almost poetic consequence for a man who had assumed that deception could shield him from accountability. I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was no joy in seeing Evan fall, no triumph in the crumbling of his carefully crafted image. Instead, there was relief, a profound, steady sense of calm. The weight of years of uncertainty and quiet observation lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to manage his impulsive choices, clean up the chaos, or fear the next secret betrayal. I poured myself a cup of tea in the quiet of my own kitchen, the aroma of chamomile filling the room, and I let myself reflect. Life was fragile but also fair in a strange, delayed way. The house was mine. My savings were safe. My children had witnessed the truth and stood with me. And the man who had sought to dismantle it all was now alone, stripped of the illusions he had counted on. Through all of this, I felt vindication without cruelty. The focus wasn't on revenge, it was on justice, and on reclaiming the life that had been quietly stolen from me over decades. The aftermath wasn't glamorous or flashy, it was quiet, measured, and ultimately real. As I looked out the window at the quiet Naperville street, kids playing in the distance and neighbors walking dogs, I realized something. The consequences had begun, but life, my life, was just beginning to breathe freely again. The quiet of my home after the storm of betrayal was a strange kind of freedom. I no longer had to tiptoe around secrets, no longer had to balance Evan's impulsive decisions with my own responsibilities. For the first time in decades, I could finally focus on myself. And that meant pursuing a dream I had put on hold for far too long, my catering business. I rented a small, sunlit space in Illinois, just a few blocks from the town square. The building wasn't fancy, just a modest kitchen and a tiny storefront, but it was mine, and it represented everything I had held inside for years. With every small renovation, every coat of paint, I felt a sense of ownership over my life that no betrayal could take away. The first clients were humble but meaningful, PTA bake sales, church gatherings, and neighborhood events. I baked everything from scratch: cookies, cupcakes, and custom cakes for birthdays and anniversaries. It was the kind of work that allowed me to see the joy on people's faces, the same joy I had always wanted to give my own family. My grandkids became part of this new chapter too. They loved helping me decorate cupcakes, carefully piping swirls of frosting and adding sprinkles just so. Their laughter filled the kitchen, echoing off the walls in a way that reminded me of simpler times, times when family meant everything, and the heart of the home was always busy, warm, and loving. Every morning, I woke up feeling purposeful. I checked orders, experimented with new recipes, and called on old friends from Naperville, Lisle, and nearby communities who wanted a taste of something homemade, heartfelt, and personal. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon I had recurring clients for birthday parties, baby showers, and local events. It wasn't just the baking that gave me purpose, it was the feeling of control, pride, and independence. I was no longer cleaning up after someone else's mistakes or covering for someone else's lies. This was my work, my passion, my life. Even when I glanced at the Maplewood Lane home from afar, the memories of the past didn't sting the way they used to. I had reclaimed my space, my family's trust, and my dreams. Evan's shadow was fading fast, replaced by the warm, bright life I had built for myself and my children. I began to realize that rebuilding wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about creating something better, stronger, and fully my own. Each cupcake, each smile from a neighbor, each message of thanks from a satisfied client reminded me that the hardest chapters often lead to the most fulfilling beginnings. And as I watched my grandchildren carefully place tiny chocolate chips on cupcakes, their small hands guided by mine, I knew this life, filled with purpose, love, and honest work, was exactly where I was meant to be. Exactly 1 year after the anniversary party that had upended our lives, I returned to the DuPage County Courthouse in Wheaton. The winter air bit at my cheeks, but inside I felt a quiet warmth, an inner calm that comes from knowing justice, finally, was about to be served. The courtroom looked familiar, yet today it felt lighter. The whispers, the stares, the tension that had hung like a heavy fog during the first hearing were gone. This was the final chapter. I carried with me all the careful documentation I had prepared over the months: bank statements, recordings, and detailed records of Evan's transgressions, but I didn't need them this time. The truth had already spoken for itself. Evan walked in behind his young, nervous attorney, attempting the same confident air he always had. But the faint crease on his forehead, the nervous tapping of his fingers on the wood of the counsel table, betrayed his unease. He knew the story, and now the law was about to confirm it. Judge Hensley presided again, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room as she called the case to order. She reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the fidelity clause, and the financial evidence once more. After careful deliberation, she finally spoke. After reviewing all evidence, the court finds in favor of Mrs. Lorraine Caldwell. The marital home, retirement accounts, and 75% of joint investments remain under her possession. Mr. Caldwell retains only his personal accounts, with no claims to assets diverted or misappropriated. The divorce is hereby finalized. A soft exhale escaped me as the gavel came down. The sound was not just a formal declaration, it was the sound of justice, closure, and liberation. Evan's face went pale, his shoulders sagged, and he didn't utter a word. He packed his briefcase quietly and left, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. His carefully constructed illusions had crumbled silently, leaving him to face the reality of the life he had chosen. I stayed seated for a moment, taking in the weight of what had just happened. The house, the financial security, the sense of freedom, it was mine. My children had stood by me, my grandkids were safe, and the woman who had built a life of honesty, patience, and foresight had finally reclaimed what was hers. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds. It felt symbolic. After months of betrayal, manipulation, and uncertainty, a new chapter had begun. Evan's departure was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it didn't need to be loud. The real victory wasn't in confrontation, it was in standing tall, knowing that the truth and justice had prevailed. For the first time in years, I could breathe fully. The life I had imagined for decades, the dreams I had postponed, and the freedom I had longed for were now mine, not as a fantasy, but as reality. And in that quiet moment, walking down the courthouse steps, I knew this ending was exactly the beginning I had been waiting for. The house on Maplewood Lane felt warmer than ever that evening. Winter lights twinkled outside the front windows, reflecting off the freshly polished floors and casting soft patterns on the walls. I had invited only my closest family, my children, Natalie and Chris, Marcus and his fiancée Elise, and of course my two grandkids, Liam and Sophie. The aroma of roast chicken, baked potatoes, and rosemary bread filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon from the freshly baked apple pie cooling on the counter. As everyone gathered around the large oak dining table, laughter began to rise naturally. Liam insisted on telling the same joke about the family dog Max, and Sophie couldn't stop giggling at his dramatic delivery. Chris teased Natalie gently about her obsession with trying every dessert first, and Marcus recounted a funny story from his new marketing job in Denver. It was ordinary. It was real. And it was perfect. I poured wine into each glass and clinked mine lightly against Marcus's. "To new beginnings," I said, my voice calm but full of quiet triumph. No one needed to ask who or what we were celebrating. It was the reclaiming of life, of family, and of peace. For a moment, I caught my own reflection in the window. I saw a woman who had weathered betrayal, deceit, and heartbreak, but who had emerged with grace, strength, and dignity. There was no bitterness, no anger consuming me anymore. The past had happened, yes, but it no longer defined the present. We lingered over dinner, sharing stories, teasing one another, and simply enjoying being together. Outside, the world continued, with its noise and its chaos, but inside these walls, there was warmth, laughter, and a sense of home that Evan could never take away. Later, as I cleared the dishes with the kids helping, Sophie whispered, "Grandma, this is the best night ever." Liam nodded enthusiastically, crumbs of pie on his chin. And in that moment, I realized how true it was. The life I had built for myself, grounded in honesty and love, was more beautiful than anything I had imagined. I sat down finally in the living room, watching the kids chase each other while Natalie and Marcus settled into the couch beside me. The house was alive with joy, and I felt a profound calm I hadn't known in years. The memories of Evan's betrayal felt distant, almost surreal, like a storm that had passed long ago. And as the last candle flickered on the table and the soft music from the kitchen filled the room, I whispered to myself, a quiet smile tugging at my lips. The life he left behind turned out to be the one worth living. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.